Hello everybody, welcome to week 2. This week we'll be discussing the history of conservation law enforcement. So conservation law enforcement has been around for a really long time, just not really in its current form. The earliest evidence we have of some sort of game laws was in about the 6th century Germanic codes. Well, these codes were not specifically for protection of game, but rather were supposed to protect crops from damage. Punishments were harsh for violating those laws. And there is a recorded story of someone being buried alive under a pile of rocks for poaching a red deer. And then when William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, he did tighten up game laws because under his rule, he believed that the king owned all wild beasts, right? So all the wildlife belonged to the king. And when he did that, he also introduced mutilation as a punishment for poaching. So mutilation was around for about 100 years or so. Then it was removed in 1184. Then in 1225, the Forest Charter of Henry III stated that no one would lose life or limb for killing a deer, but would suffer a grievous fine. And if they didn't have any money, then they would go to jail for a year and a day. So you're starting to see, where things are kind of getting more similar to what we have today. So with this forest charter, around the same time, all the forests had a chief forester, which is kind of the first evidence of what you would call conservation officers. They received their posts of inheritance or were appointed by the crown, and they had the ability to arrest, and they also patrolled an assigned area. So, it's sounding more and more kind of similar to what we know today as conservation officers. And even though there's still some fairly severe punishments for poaching, still quite a bit of it took place, and it was by people of all socioeconomic classes. It wasn't just poor people trying to get food. It was people of all classes. All right, so now we're going to jump a little bit, and then we're going to go to the Game Act of 1671. And this established the qualification for someone needed to be able to take game. So this act also gave official status to gamekeepers, who were, this kind of sort of special police that were there to enforce game laws. They had powers to confiscate hunting equipment, search houses, and arrest poachers through whatever force was necessary. So, as you can probably guess, there was quite a bit of corruption associated with these positions, and oftentimes it was former poachers that they hired for these positions, because who's better to catch a poacher than another poacher or former poacher. Very little oversight, and many of these gamekeepers, because remember, any force necessary, right? So there's quite a bit of brutality associated with these gamekeepers. A lot of them did poach wildlife and sell wildlife illegally. And there's a variety of other laws that were acted that outline penalties and other aspects of game laws. One of those is the Black Act of 1723. That stated that anybody who was caught disguised with weapons to kill deer would be subject to the death penalty. And then in 1737, King George enacted an act that sentenced anyone who was deer or waterfowl poaching to 7 years of labor in America. And then if you returned prior to 7 years, you'd be put to death. Then we have the Ellenborough Act of 1803, and that stated that anyone offering armed resistance to being arrested would be hanged. And these harsh penalties did not stop poaching. So there's a whole other group of laws that were created to start protecting species, and they started about 1393. And if you look in the PowerPoint that I provided, it's got kind of an outline of some of those laws too. I'm not going to get into them here necessarily. So what we were talking about before was all England. All right. So in America, people thought that there was so much game that it could never ever become extinct, or there would never be less game. So anyone that could hunt, or anyone who wanted to hunt, could hunt. And remember too, you've got people that were sent to America from England as punishment for poaching. So you start getting a lot of those people over here, plus other people that came to America from England, were also sent there because they were considered radicals or criminals or whatever, what have you. So the attitude in America was going to be quite a bit different than that in England. So anyone could hunt, and there was even market hunting that was used to supply food for the towns and cities. However, they did start regulating some hunting in the 1600s, but there was kind of this overall rejection of English laws and wildlife laws. And you can still see some of the remnants of this towards some modern day views toward wildlife laws. And if you look at kind of the history of English laws, so even though the colonists and Americans kind of rejected this whole English way of doing things, if you look at how wildlife laws kind of developed in the United States or in America, they're very, very similar to English laws, very similar to how policing over here evolved, from British policing. All right, so that's kind of a real quick kind of history of game laws and conservation law enforcement. So since this course is in Missouri, and we're at Missouri State, let's talk about the Missouri experience a little bit. So the Walmsley Act was passed in 1905, and this was the first act that provided for wildlife or conservation law enforcement. Most were political appointees, which is not too unlike early police officers, right? A lot of early police officers were political appointees, so a lot of your early game wardens were also political appointees. Then in 1937, the Conservation Commission was created, and it inherited 40 politically appointed wardens and about 5,000 special deputy wardens. Those were mostly political supporters. There were also some other specialty cards that were given out, honorary and courtesy cards. There's all kinds of political stuff that went on before the Conservation Commission was created. So once the commission was created, they revoked all those honorary and courtesy cards that were issued to former political supporters. Then in 1938, they hired the first class of conservation officers. They hired 35 new wardens, 14 of which were actually prior political appointees. They went through the process and were hired, and there were over 700 applicants for that first class. And then the new recruits went through a short kind of training period. Protection Division, which currently houses conservation officers in the Missouri Department of Conservation, was created in 1941. They had the first actual academy starting in 1951, and it lasted for 4.5 months. Now it's up around 6 months, and it covered department operations, law enforcement, and court procedure. Now there's quite a bit more that goes into that. Protection Division became a permanent division in 1977 after some reorganization, and currently there's about 180 conservation officers in Missouri. All right, so just quick and short history discussion of conservation laws and conservation law enforcement. Be sure to read everything that's provided for this week and complete your assignments. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll see you next week.